So the two technologies that we're going to look at today is one of them is going to be ActiveAdmin. It is a gem specifically for Rails development that creates an administrative backend. So it does a lot of what scaffolding did for us in that you point it to a model or a set of models and it builds a whole set of CRUD tasks to interact with those models so that you can create new entries in the database for those models, edit them, delete them. But it also puts that behind a username and password. So that way, it could be used for really easily adding content management functionality to a Rails application, because you just point, okay, these are the models that I want an administrator to be able to access. You would create a bunch of admin accounts. It handles all the usernames and passwords. It does the login prompting. It does all of that for you. So you get a lot of functionality out of ActiveAdmin effectively for free. So it's a really neat gem. I encourage you all to use it on the second project in the course. There's a bunch of marks that are associated with having an administrative dashboard, and you'll just get those marks by using ActiveAdmin. There have been students in the past that have wanted to implement their own back-end dashboard just because they wanted the challenge of doing that, of handling logins and all those kind of things. So you could, of course, do that all yourself, or you could do what we're going to look at today, which is just to bring ActiveAdmin into the picture. The other thing that I want to look at today is we're going to do the back end. We'll build a few models and do the back end. And then I'll hop over to the front end and start displaying some of the data that we enter in as an administrator. And in the display of that, I'm going to show you something called view partials, which are similar to methods, but for ERB. So anytime when we're writing code where we see sort of wholesale repetition of concepts or just wholesale repetition of code, we usually extract that out to a method so that we can make a method call so that we don't have to repeat ourselves so often. In creating Rails applications, you sometimes see the wholesale repetition of either markup or ERB code, and we can use partials to remove that repetition, and you call the partials from your views like you would make a method call. So they're just a way of abstracting out that repetition. So those are the two things we'll look at today. I'm going to start by creating a new Rails project. So I've SSH'd into my Vagrant box, and I'm in my Vagrant Rails subfolder, and I'm just going to say Rails new, and I'll call this ActiveAdmin with partials, big long name for a project. And I will now open that up inside of RubyMine. ActiveAdmin with partials. Current window. So it's just picked up that some of the gems in the gem file need to be loaded, so I'll just click this install. It'll run a bundle install for us. We're going to end up having to do that again in a moment's time anyways, because we're going to need to edit the gem file to add ActiveAdmin as a gem, and we'll be also adding the devise gem, which is the gem that ActiveAdmin relies upon for username and password authentication. The other thing I'll try to do fairly consistently that I wasn't doing with the other section was sort of making git commits along the way, so that once I do publish video, there'll be a Git repository that has sort of incremental snapshots along the way. So I'll do my first git commit right now. So it's Control K to bring up the commit message here, and I'll just say initial commit of a new Rails app. I should probably, sort of as a matter of course, always remove that idea file from the git ignore. So doing ignore idea star. And then I'll commit that as well. Okay. So as I said, what we want to start with is by editing the gem file. We would know which gem to add because we would be over here in our documentation for ActiveAdmin. The docs are pretty good, and it tells us that the first thing that we want to do is in our gem file add gem ActiveAdmin. So I'll scroll down to just above where we have the grouped gems, and I will add that right here. What the docs don't tell you, but what you get as a message if you were to run bundle install, is that there is a dependency on devise. And this is one of the few times when you have to explicitly mention the dependency. Usually if a gem depends on another gem, bundler will just automatically detect that and pull that in. It doesn't seem to be the case with ActiveAdmin, so I always have to include not only ActiveAdmin, but devise in the gem file to get ActiveAdmin to work. And once we have that in there, either RubyMine will pick up the fact that we've got new gems, and it'll sort of prompt us to do a bundle install, but we can always force that by going to Tools, Bundler, Install, and running that. And then if we, while that's running, go back to the documentation here. So the next step, it says after you update your bundle, run the installer. So we've done Rails G or Rails generate a number of times before to generate scaffolds or to generate models or controllers. ActiveAdmin, when you install it, it adds a new generator. So this is one of the things that gems can hook into, is they can add custom generators to Rails. And it's added this ActiveAdmin install generator that we'll be able to run now. So we can get that from Tools, Run Rails Generator, or at the command prompt we could do a Rails G, and it's ActiveAdmin install is the generator that we want to run. And we don't need any arguments, do we? Nope. So I just click OK. And that gives us some information, get a little bit of things you should do to set your project up to work well, and then you get sort of a listing of all the new files and folders that were added to your project. Rails supports internationalization, and devise also supports that by default. So devise gives you this file, devise.en.yml, where it's like all of the text around all of the authentication tasks. If you wanted to translate this text and provide it in other languages, you could do so. So this is in the config locales folder, and you could just drop in, like if you wanted a French one, you'd put a devise.fr.yml, and you'd grab the same file and replace all the English strings with French strings, and devise would just be multilingual at that point. And it's, I mean, that works for all of Rails. You can do that for your own applications. You can put in placeholders within your ERB and then have locale files for all the actual text, similar to how Android does its string XML files. Okay, that's all we need for that. I can close down those files there. So ActiveAdmin is now installed into our system, and the docs tell us now that we need to run a migration, and so we're going to do just that, rake db migrate, or run this Rails, run rake task, and it'll be the db migrate task. And this is because ActiveAdmin has a few tables that it needs to be brought into existence. It has a users table or an admin users table and a admin comments table. And so you can see those two tables have now been created. And it also adds to Rails seed file so that you can have a default administrative user. So we're also going to run a rake task, which is going to be rake db seed. And that will give us a default user to log in to the system with. And so now we can run Rails. So I'll go to run and then run again. And I want to run in development mode. I'll give the server a second to start up. What's it complaining about now? Big error message. It looks like in a previous version of, I guess probably last time, I probably didn't properly shut down Puma. So that's it running. There we are. So yeah, when I did the lecture with the last group, I had probably not properly set down my server when I shut down RubyMine, and so I had like a orphan version of Puma running in the background. So I was able to run a PS, which shows me the processes that are running, and I piped that to grep to look for Puma anywhere in the process list, which give me the process ID, and then I could do a kill-9 on that process ID to kill that version of Puma, and I now should be good to go again to try to run this. That's one of the things why when working in the web world, it's really good to have Linux skills, because you come up against those little problems that are solved with a few Unix commands. And there we go. So things are up and running now, which means I should be able to go to localhost. Just straight up localhost 3000 gives me my welcome screen because I don't yet have any front end to this website, but the back end exists at /admin. This will give me a user and password prompt, and we have that default administrative user that we got by way of the seed file, and it's going to be admin@example.com, and the password is password. So very secure default. And here they are. So admin@example.com with a password of password. And I log in. And there's our backend. We can't do so much right now because we don't have any models with which to interact with, but we could interact with the two models that ActiveAdmin has added to our system, the administrative users model or the comments model. So if we went into this admin users model, there's that one administrative user, admin@example.com. I could add a new, more secure user at this point with an email address, put the password in twice to confirm it, and then I could go and I could delete this insecure one at that point. But yeah, there's not much for us to do here. So the next step for us is now to create some models and to register those models with ActiveAdmin. So before I do that, I will do a git commit. So it still wants all of my idea files. Okay. It'll say install the ActiveAdmin gem. here we go. Next up, generator. So I'm going to create a few new models. And I'm just going to recreate a little bit of what I did for my version of the project, which was the board game website. So I'm going to create a board game model and a category model, and I'm going to make a one-to-many association between those things. So here I'm going to say board game, and I'm going to make it so that a board game isn't very complicated. A board game is going to have a name, colon, string, and I'll give it a rating, colon, decimal, and I will give it a category, colon, references. So we don't yet have a categories table, but this is in anticipation of that. So board game, camel cased, name, which is a string, rating, which is a decimal, and a category, which is of type references, which is a foreign key. So that gives me my board game model. It already puts in my belongs to category in there. It gives me my migration, which will create that table with the name and the rating and the category reference. And I can make another generator for a model for the category. And the category is even going to be simpler. It's only going to be a name of type string. And the only thing I need to do manually here is after creating the category, I have to specify that it has many board games. I now have two migrations that are due to be run, so I can go to run my rake task and do a db migrate. And that'll bring the categories table and the board games table into existence. And I can commit these changes now. Added the board game and category models. And now I need to register these models with ActiveAdmin, and at that point I'll be able to start adding categories and adding board games from that back end. So how do I do that? Well, that's done by way of more tasks that ActiveAdmin has added to my system. Let's see if it says in our, yeah, it's through generators. So we're going to do a Rails generate command, and specifically for ActiveAdmin resource, and then we're going to specify with that which model we wish to generate. So tools generator, ActiveAdmin resource, this one right here, and we have to do this twice. Once for board game, and again ActiveAdmin resource for category. And what that does is I now have a new folder within my app folder called admin. And inside of that admin folder, you'll see that there is a boardgames.rb and a categories.rb. And it's within these files where we get to specify to ActiveAdmin which columns within these tables the admin user has permissions to modify. So maybe we don't want them to change all of the columns or have CRUD access to all of the columns. We can specify that here, or we can just allow them to change everything. And so for my categories, I'm going to do the way we do it, and there's some documentation put into these files as comments to explain what to do. We do a permit, params, and then the list of parameters that we want the admin user to be able to modify as symbols. And so we only have a name for the categories. And then for the board games, we can do a permit, params, we have a name, we have a rating, and we have a category ID. And so the only thing there that might be not super intuitive is like when we first created the board games, we said we wanted a category : references, but here I specify category ID because that's what the column name actually ends up being in the board games table. And we could know that by looking at the DB schema. So remembering the schema always gives us an idea of what's in our database. And so you can see in board games, my request for a category references became an integer column called category ID. So that's why here I needed to specify category ID. That's the thing I wanted to modify. Okay, with all of that in place, I can go to my development server and stop it and start it again. And I should now be able to go back to that back-end administrative dashboard and have full CRUD access to those two things. So if I reload this, there we go. Board games, categories. I'll create some categories first and then some board games because we want to associate the board games with categories. And so, new category. The name will be like, I'll say, dice rolling. I guess I entered that in before. I can also, for example, if I had validations on these things. So if in my board game model I had validates, name, presence, true, in there, I would restart my server again. Active admin will conform to my validations as well. And so if I go back to here, and I try to create a new category and I leave the name out, that should not have worked. Oh, it's because I was editing the wrong one. It was not, I was in the board game one. I should put the same into the category. And then meanwhile, I'll delete this one here because I don't want an empty category. Okay, let's try that again. Category, create category, telling me it can't be blank. If there was other validations, those would trigger as well. And now I can create, let's say, a music category for my board games. If I go back to categories, I can see a list of all the categories that are in my system, when they were created, when they were updated. I have this nice little filtering system here, so if I had a lot of rows, I could filter based on the name containing a particular thing, or exactly equaling, or starting with, or ending with, or filtering based on when things were created or updated. That's all done by way of the ransack gem that is brought in as part of Active Admin. Active Admin also makes use of Kaminari, the pagination gem, so if there was lots of categories in here, they would be paginated and I could page through them. And then you could also see here, there's a little section here that allows me to download. And so again, if I had a really big data set, I could download that as CSV or XML or JSON for whatever purposes I might want. If I head over to board games, Active Admin is going to notice that my board game belongs to a category. And so it'll see that there's an association there. So when I go to create a new board game, it'll automatically go to the categories table, pull all the categories, and give me a drop down of the categories so that I can associate to one of those by way of their primary key. So that's also a really nice feature. And it's got a little asterisk beside it, so it's required. You can't create a board game without associating it to a category. So if I tried to create this, you would see that we have those validations. Dice rolling game, okay, zombie dice, give it a rating, create my board game, and I'm done. And so when you look at an individual entry of a board game, it shows you which category it belongs to, that you can navigate over to that category. Notice there's also a commenting field. So again, this is for potentially you have multiple admins working with this tool, and they could be, I could leave a comment on this. Should we rename this category to dice throwing, question mark? And it'll leave that as a comment, and it'll say like which user left it, and so you could sort of have your administrators being able to communicate with each other by way of commenting on the things that ActiveAdmin has CRUD access to. So it's a very powerful system. Anytime I build a Rails application that needs some kind of content management, I just install ActiveAdmin, and it just works really, really well. There are other administrative dashboards available as gems, and I've been meaning to check them out over the years, but I really haven't had a need to, just because ActiveAdmin does almost everything I've ever wanted it to do. So for example, all of the election sites that I've built over the years, the Winnipeg election and Manitoba ones, they've all been backed by ActiveAdmin. And they work really nicely. And I only discovered this gem one of the very first times I ran this project in this course, and I came into class one day and there was a bunch of students like giggling at the back of the class, and they thought that they had were cheating because they had found this gem that did a bunch of the things that the project required, and they were going to get all these marks just by plugging in ActiveAdmin. I was like, what's up? They're like, well, we found this thing, can we use it? I was like, of course, I'm going to start using that. So students showed me this gem, and I've been using it ever since, which is awesome.
We had a thing on Frontend too, so now we deserve to.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, you had to make a content management in WebDev 2 all, by hand, so you've felt that pain, and now you don't need to anymore. You can just plug in something like this. And there's other frameworks have these kind of things as well, like in the Python world, Django, which is a very similar framework to Rails. Django just has an admin dashboard as part of the framework. It's not even a separate library. It's just like every Django app you make comes with an admin dashboard, just default to the framework. Okay, so that's the back end of this site. Let's build a little bit of the front end, and I'll talk about these things called view partials that I mentioned earlier on. And so to do that, maybe I'll do another commit message here. So what am I committing? I've got some unversioned files. Okay. Added active admin resources for board games and categories. All right, I'll close all this stuff down. Let's generate a new controller, and we'll call it board games, and I will give it an index and a show action, and it just tells me here in little text, enter actions separated with spaces, so that's why I've done index space show. And those are the only two that I'm going to need, because all of the other CRUD tasks are already generated for me by way of the ActiveAdmin dashboard. This needs to be board games like that, I think. Let's soon see. Yeah. So I get a board games controller. It already has an index action and a show action because that's what I asked for. If we look in the views folder, there's already a board game subfolder with a HTML ERB file waiting to be used for the index and the show. And the routing file, I want to update that. So in my config folder, I'm going to open the routes. These two routes were added auto-magically for me. I don't want those in there. I want my own routes. I'd like to make it so that this index action, I'd like to make it so that a get request to /board games loads up that action. But I'd also like a get request to just the root of the application to load that up. For the show, I'd like a get request to board games /some ID to load that show action up, and then have it use that ID to pull that particular board game from the model. So to do those routes, I could manually build them. So like, for example, I could say get board games, and that routes to the board games controller's index action, and I could say get board games /ID, and I want that go to the board games controller's show action, and then I want a route to go to board games index. That's all good. However, Rails always gives us these little helpful tools that build things for us. And so if you remember when we were using scaffolding, we had this thing called resources that sort of built all of the 7 RESTful routes that Rails makes use of. I can use that now for my index and my show. I can say resources board games. I don't need all 7 RESTful routes. I only need index and show. And what that'll do is it'll build that one for me, and it'll build that one for me. So as long as I know how Rails builds routes, I can do this. So now I should be able to start and stop my development server. And I will test out those routes, and what should happen is I should, there's nothing in those actions yet, but there is associated views. So when I go to the index, I should see, board games, # index, and this find me message. Same thing goes for the show. So I should be able to test those routes out now. So the route should show the index view. There it is. /board games on its own should also show that index view, and /board games /some number should show the show view. Okay, so that means my routes are working. Meanwhile, over here, I probably want to load up all the board games, maybe ordered by name, and then over here I want to load up a board game, and I want to pull the board game from the params hash at position ID. And so again, params is where our get and post parameters end up. I have this placeholder inside of my route. So even though I didn't define that, that's what resources is going to provide for me when it builds me a show route, because that's a member route, and our member routes always have IDs. And so I'm going to pull the ID from the params hash, pass that defined, and I'll get a single board game back. So that's the data that I need for these 2 different views. And then I can modify this a little bit. Oops. Here I could say, well, go to my board games, and then for each one of them, call it board game, and then end on that. And then within here, I could say, well, within an H2, show the board game's name, and then within a paragraph tag, put a strong tag that says rating. And then, I've missed a close tag somewhere. Everything's messed up. There it is. I think, is that looking correct? No, it needs to be inside of here. There we are. That's looking better. And then here I can echo out the board game rating. Oops, hit the wrong magical key there. Rating, and then category, and And then here I should be able to chain to the categories name. So that should, for my collection of board games, grab each individual board game, display their name, display the rating, display the categories name. Now I only have one board game in my system, but we should be able to test this out and see one, and then maybe we can go into the back end and make another one. And this is so anytime you get this message, so it says here, undefined method each for nil class nil. So it's saying that this right here, board games, is nil. That's just an indication that I didn't restart my server. Right? I've made changes to my controller and they weren't picked up. And again, this is a problem with the way we're using Rails, specifically the fact that we're using Rails through a shared drive to Vagrant. The Rails server isn't able to pick up these changes, whereas if we were running Rails natively, we would never have to restart the server and it would just pick these changes up for us automatically. I'm not used to restarting the server because when I'm normally developing Rails, I'm on a Mac, and so then I will be running it natively and it just sort of works. And so there's the display, right? There's my zombie dice. If I go to the back end again, so if I go to admin and add a new board game, board game of type music. This is Guitar Hero, the board game. It was not well received. And now I have 2 games in my system. And there they are. You can see the styling is not your standard sort of unstyled HTML page that you normally get with Rails. What's happened is ActiveAdmin has injected some styling, some CSS into the application for us. At the end of this lecture, I'll show you how to sort of isolate that just to the back end, because you often don't want ActiveAdmin styles to sort of be polluting the front end of your application. Okay, so that's the index. The show is going to be fairly similar, right? I could probably take some of this stuff here and put it over into here. Oops, undo, put it into here. And then move these over a little bit. And then just put an @ sign in front of each one of those. And now if I go to /boardgame/1, there it is, or /boardgame/2, there it is. It'd be nice to be able to link from the index page to the show page. So for example, along with each listing, I might have a link to that says view details that links to the board game. So that's over here. And now with each one of these, I have this view details link that links me over there. So I've implemented the index and the show. One of the things you saw me do when I was implementing that is I straight up copy and pasted a big chunk of code from the index into the show page. And so in the Rails world, we would say that's not being very dry, where dry is an acronym for don't repeat yourself, right? And so I've just, wholesale repeated a bunch of stuff. Now, repetition isn't the end of the world in coding, and sometimes new programmers get overly focused on removing repetition from their code, but there is a nice, fairly simple solution to removing this repetition. Now, why would we want to remove this repetition? Well, as I said, it's not the end of the world. But if I'm going to start developing this app and I'm going to be adding more and more to what it means to be a board game, every time I add a new property to a board game, I'm going to have to update, in two places the display of a board game, right? So what it is to be a board game in HTML is represented here, and it's also represented here. So if I add a new column to the board games table, I'm going to have to add a display, some display content here, and also over here. And that'll just get frustrating. Eventually I'll forget to do it in one place versus the other. Maybe the two things will become out of sync. If I'm starting to work on styling, and I have to change the markup, maybe to implement Bootstrap, I'm again going to have to be changing it in those two locations. So it would make sense here to somehow extract out the commonality between the index and the show and put it in one place. And that's what view partials are for. So I'm going to, in my board games folder, in the views subfolder, create a new file. And with partials, naming conventions, well, with most things in Rails, naming conventions becomes very important. So all partials always start with an underscore. That's just a way of identifying them as a partial. And then what is this a partial for? Well, this is a partial for a board game, so I call it as such. And then it's an html.erb file. Do a bit of a commit here. So unversioned files, what are they? Oh yeah. Adding to display board game details. And I'm going to take from this show, I'm going to take that and copy and paste it into here. That didn't take it. Yank and paste. My hotkeys in RubyMine don't work as I expect them to. Oh well. And then I also want to take this with me. And now I'm going to remove the @ sign from that. So the most common usage of a partial is to display a particular object that is a model object. And so in this case, I've named the partial after the type of object that I'm about to display, but in snake case rather than camel case. And then I reference a variable named after both the file name and the type of object that I'm about to display, again, board game. And so boardgame.name, boardgame.rating, this naming convention stuff is super important. If we don't do this properly, this partial is just not going to work. And then from within my show, instead of having all of that repeated, I can now say render, and what do I render? Render partial. There's like short forms of doing this and long forms of doing this, and so I'll probably show you both. I think the short form is just this. Render board game. That is my @boardgame variable that was made available in the show controller, right? So there's the controller action, loads up this @boardgame. In show, I say render board game. Rails does a few things auto-magically here. One, it goes, oh, okay, you want to show a board game. What type of model is this? Oh, it's a board game. I will go and look in the board games folder and see if there's a partial called board game. There is. Okay, I will make a new variable automatically called board game without the @ and put it in there and make it available to that partial. So that sort of stitches all those things together by way of convention. Same thing goes for the index. In the index, I can delete all of that And instead of saying render board game, I can say render board games. And the magic Rails does here is it says, oh, I have a collection of model objects. What type are they? Oh, they are of type board game. Do I have a partial for that? I do. I will render this partial once for every element in this collection, making each one of them named board game for that partial. And so it really, this is what we talk about drying up your code, right? We've extracted this repetitive code out here, and we have very dry views in that show. We just render the board game, and here we render board games. From the front end side of things, we shouldn't see any difference, right? This should just look identical to how it looked before. And so there's my two, and then I click on one of them, and there it is. A little bit awkward in that now on the show page, we still see this view details, which just links us to the page that we're already on. So we'll remove that in a moment, but basically we're done. I could now start adding more and more details to this partial and having that reflected both on the index and on the show. I find that students don't like the magic in Rails. Like it seems like, oh, it's magical, but it's sort of hard to understand what's happening when there's a lot of magic. So I find a lot of students like it when I show the more explicit way to render a partial. So I'll show you that now. So without magic, we would say render partial, and then we'd ask for the partial by name. If we being the view was in another view folder, we would have to path to it, and that's why RubyMind's showing us both of these options. So if I was in a view that wasn't part of the board games view, I would say board games / board game, but I'm in the folder already, so I just reference board game. I don't need to reference the underscore. That's just assumed when I'm using a partial. So I'm rendering a partial board game, and for the index, I want to render it with the collection that is board games. So that's the more explicit way of rendering it, and I find this a little bit more clear. When you remove the magic in Rails, I think things become more clear. Here, again, I want to render the partial called board game, and I want to, in this case, render it once for the object board game. And again, we won't, from the front end, see anything visually different here. If you do it the magic way, no, it doesn't matter if it's in another folder, as long as you've, again, got all the naming conventions stitched together correctly. So if it's in the board games folder and it's called underscore board game, then yeah, you can just, from any other folder, just say render board game. Now, one of the benefits of this expanded view is that we can now do something that we couldn't do otherwise, which is pass arguments to our partials. So I was earlier on mentioning that these partials were sort of like method calls, but for HTML. Well, with most method calls, you want the ability to be able to pass in data to that method by way of arguments. Let's say in some cases I want this link that says view details to be displayed, and in other cases I don't want that to be displayed. So it might be nice to be able to do something like if show view details or show details link. That show details link variable doesn't yet exist. I'm going to make it exist in a moment. So now I have conditionally, I'm going to conditionally show that if this is true and or false, it's dependent. To make that available, this show details link available to this partial, I have to pass it in. So I'm going to format this a little nicer here. And one of the things I can say is I can say locals, and I can provide a hash of local variables that I want to make available to the partial. And so I'm rendering from the show page. On the show page, I don't want to display this link. So I'm going to say show details link false. And so that will pass that data into the partial for me. Over at the index, well, I'll restructure this a little bit. And I'll say locals, and then a hash, show details, link, true. And then again, I'll restart my server. Here. So here is the index view. We should, when we reload this page, still see those view details links, except when we don't. Show details link. Did I typo it? I did. It's like 99.9% of all of my coding problems are just typos. How about all of you? I typo a lot. There we are. Oh, there we are. Okay, reloading. And we click through, and it's gone. One other use of partials is sometimes, and it's also what we use methods for, even if we're not going to reuse them, sometimes it's nice to take a chunk of code, give it a nice name, give it a place to live in a file, just for organizational purposes. And so, for example, one thing that I find myself doing often in a Rails application is we have our layout file, which is that applications HTML ERB file in the layouts folder. It's a pretty simple file. It's pretty clean looking. As an application grows, we start to add to this file. You might put into it like a header, and you might put into it a footer. And within the header, there might be a nav, and within that nav, you might be doing your navigation by way of a series of LIs. And suddenly this file's not as nice and simple and clean anymore. And especially if you're using Bootstrap, like to implement a menu, it's a big chunk of Bootstrap provided markup with all sorts of classes associated with it. So it might just be nice to be able to take this out, put it into its own partial, and just have the partial called there, just to clean up the sort of the look of our layout file, just to structure it better, give our our header a home, that kind of thing. So what I do for that, and there's no real strong opinions around this, there's nothing built into Rails proper convention-wise about doing this. I typically in my views folder just create a new folder, and I call it shared, or I call it shared partials, or something along those lines. And then inside of there, I'm going to create a new file, and I'll call it maybe I'll call it header menu.html.erb. But I can't forget that I need an underscore in front of it. And so there's my header menu, and then it's at this point where I would go like this, and paste that in over here. So I don't have a whole bunch of different pages to link to, but I could at least have, say, just a link to home here, which would just go to the root route, or the root path. And then from my application layout, I can, make things fairly clean again, get rid of that footer. And then here, it would just be a matter of rendering the partial. And then here I do have the path to it. I would say shared header. And so that will load this up at the top of all of my pages. So again, if I close that and start that up again, we should see that happening up here. So not the prettiest of menus, it still needs to be styled, but you can see I've got this home link up at the top, and it's now present on all pages because it's part of my layout. So I can go back over here and home again. Okay, so I will do another commit here. Partials for board games and a layout menu. And then the last thing I'm going to show is that I did mention that, like, right now ActiveAdmin is actively polluting the rest of our application with its CSS. So if I viewed source on this page, we would see like a whole bunch of stuff at the top of the document there. And you can see some of it's Rails proper, but Rails no longer has a dependency on jQuery, so that's something that ActiveAdmin would have added. A whole bunch of jQuery UI stuff, ActiveAdmin would have added that as well. Here's a whole bunch of ActiveAdmin, what looks like JavaScript and probably some CSS in there. Yeah, here's the ActiveAdmin CSS. So it's sort of polluted our app with a bunch of stuff that we probably don't want. And so I don't know why it does this, but I do know the solution to fix it. And so what it's done is in the app assets folder, that's where we put style sheets and JavaScripts. And in there, we see that there's this ActiveAdmin SCSS file. That's the ActiveAdmin stuff. If we look in the JavaScripts, we see that there's this activeadmin.js.coffee. That's that's ActiveAdmin putting in CoffeeScript. So CoffeeScript is that weird dialect of JavaScript that compiles. It makes JavaScript look and feel like Ruby, and then it compiles back to JavaScript. I don't know if there'll be any CoffeeScript in here. It's just going and requiring something from the ActiveAdmin gem. So we don't actually get to see it in the source. So I need to remove those, and I need to put them in a special place, which is this vendor folder. And let's see if I remember how to do this. Or better yet, I can, instead of just guessing, I know that I've done this before, and so I can just look what I did before. I need to make an assets folder within this vendor folder, and within there make a JavaScripts and style sheets folder. Okay, so within my vendor folder, I need a assets folder, and within that assets folder, I need a JavaScripts folder and a style sheets folder. And then I need to move these files from one place to the other. And so I need to move the ActiveAdmin file over to my vendored JavaScripts. Move, yes, 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 yes. Okay. Looks like that worked. And then style sheets, ActiveAdmin. Move that into my style sheets folder. Okay. Stop the server and start the server. The front end of the website should now look unstyled again, but if we go back to that ActiveAdmin portion of the website, it should remain styled. So if I've done everything correctly, we should lose the styling on the front of the website, but the back end should remain styled. So here I reload this. I should now lose the styling here. It'll think for a while, I guess. It's not sure it wants to lose that styling. There it is. So it looks boring and plain again, but now we can start applying our own styling without being sort of held to ActiveAdmin styling. And by going to /admin, that should still look pretty and styled, and it does. So when I view source on the back end, you can see I've got all those assets that are present there. But if I go over here and view source, I've got very few assets. And so that's called vendoring an asset. And so we have the vendor folder, and we've vendored a JavaScript file and a style sheet file. So any questions about anything that I've gone over today in terms of active admin as a tool for sort of adding content management functionality to a website, or in terms of using partials to dry up your views? Awesome.